With the summer around the corner, Mark decided it was time to finally start his DIY project in the garden. But as he and one of his buddies started to stake out their project, Mark felt a hard object touching the end of his shovel. He started digging more and unearthed a giant object, but at first he was unsure what it was. Mark decided to sleep on it overnight. But in the middle of the night, Mark woke up with a start and suddenly realized what it really was. And he called the police immediately to explain that he needed their help ASAP. However, the moment the officer laid eyes on it, Mark knew he had been correct. The police told Mark he shouldn't have seen this, and he couldn't agree more. Within minutes, there were at least 20 other officers on the scene taking care of the matter. Mark was quickly transported to the police station. He was going to have a lot of explaining to do. But what did Mark find on his property? Why did the police get involved, and why was Mark not supposed to see this thing? But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Mark's wife Patricia had been on his ass about finally getting a pool in the garden for nearly 5 years by now. It was a promise that he had made when they bought the house, but one that he had not yet delivered. They were not going on vacation this summer, and thus he had a lot of free time this year. He figured that it was a case of now or never. He hoped he would be able to finish it in about 3 weeks, but Mark would quickly run into some unexpected problems that he could not solve himself. The first step in making the pool was to dig out the hole in the garden. Because he did not want to spend too much money on the project, Mark decided to take this upon himself with the help of his 2 sons, Toby and Brian. On the second day of digging, Mark had almost gotten the hole to the depth he intended. However, he feared the worst when his shovel suddenly hit something and sounded different than wood. Mark and his sons spent the rest of the day trying to unearth their find as much as possible. But the more they got to see the metal object, the less they understood what they were dealing with. The only way that Mark could describe it was that it looked like a giant, rusted metal bullet. He considered telling somebody about his find, somebody who might know more about it. But he also knew this could come with some unwanted consequences. The object would probably have to be studied and removed very carefully, and then his whole garden might get torn apart to see if other finds could be made. He decided that the best course of action was to keep the find secret. But even with his decision made, the metal object did not leave Mark's mind that evening. He tried just to fall asleep that night, but he quickly realized that his mind was still too busy thinking about the metal object. He decided to do some research on it. He had already looked online for what it could be without any success, but had also thought of another way to investigate. He started going through the old documentation of the house to see where it was that they bought it from 5 years ago. Maybe he could contact that man and ask him if he knew more about it. He could not find much useful information about the man, but he managed to find an email address he could use. And so, with nothing to lose, he sent the man a quick message about his find. Only 2 minutes later, Mark got a message back in his inbox. He was very surprised to get such a quick response, but even more surprised by the contents of the email. When reading it, he even felt a shiver go over his spine. He had not expected to hear this tonight. The email did not explain exactly what Mark was dealing with, but it did contain a very stern warning about the object. The man begged Mark to leave the object and bury it again. Mark was stunned by the response and immediately sent an email back to ask for clarification, but realized the email address had blocked him. This meant he could no longer communicate with the man. But instead of listening to the warning of the previous owner, the interaction only made Mark more curious, as wondered, what the hell am I dealing with? The very next morning, Mark decided to call the police and share his find with them. Their first reaction was one of disbelief. Mark's story, which was incredibly strange, sounded made up. Eventually, Mark did manage to convince the officers to send somebody out to his house to come and check out his find. But soon after the police officer arrived at the house, Mark knew he would not get off easy here. While the officer was fairly clueless at first when he was led into the garden, it did not take long for him to realize what was actually going on here, and it worried him greatly. The police officers were wary of Mark suspecting that he was feigning ignorance about the mysterious object in his backyard. They doubted if he had actually had a conversation with the previous owner. As the email address had gone out of service, this proved not to be good for Mark. Thinking that Mark was simply trying to put the blame on someone else, the police officers cuffed him. Mark was taken aback by this as he found himself unexpectedly being the one apprehended. He tried to call for Patricia, his wife, or 2 sons, but was swiftly taken away. After Mark was taken to the station, he found himself stuck in an interrogation room, where across from him a detective sat. Mark tried to tell him about the past owner, but the detective quickly dismissed that. Mark felt hopeless. Mark made the decision to halt his own defense and would not utter another word until he had a lawyer present to guide him through this legal minefield. Mark and Patricia's house, once orderly, was now the center stage of an investigation of their own. A whirlwind of documents had scattered along the living room floor. However, they seemed to have hit the jackpot when they came across files that were around 11 years old. Hidden amongst those pages, the family found mention of a permit issued to the previous owner. The documentation indicated that the area of repair coincided with the exact spot where their family had decided to place their new pool and coincidentally found the large metallic object. Luckily, one of Mark's sons, Toby, was a private investigator. He found, after a lot of digging, information about the former homeowner. Unfortunately, there was a catch as he hadn't simply moved across town or to a nearby suburb. No, his new home was on the opposite side of the state. Patricia decided to stay home to support her husband, but their 2 sons, Toby and Brian, had taken it upon themselves to take the 6-hour drive. When Mark's lawyer arrived, he gave Mark a much-needed sense of reassurance. The lawyer knew that Patricia and Mark had lived in the house for about 10 years, and he was unsure of the age of the mysterious object. If the investigators could prove that the strange metal object had been underground for a similar duration, Mark would prove to be in big trouble. When Toby and Brian finally arrived at the old owner's house, they found it empty as no one seemed to be home. He started to look around the property to hopefully stumble upon one of the owners. This gave them new hope, but they did not want to sit by waiting for them to return to their home. What if this yard was another hiding place for objects such as the ones they had found? They told themselves that it was for the betterment of their father. At first, looking at the yard seemed futile, but then Toby stumbled upon the shed, and when he opened it, it truly blew his mind. He immediately took out his phone and snapped some pictures of what he had found. He was sure that whatever was in this shed would help prove his father's innocence. He quickly called Brian to come over. When Brian arrived at the shed, his eyes widened at the sight. He was in immediate agreement with his brother. This could be the breakthrough they needed. Though the shed was nearly filled to the brim with strange objects, the first things they could identify were all different types of metal detectors. However, that wasn't all the boys saw. It appeared that their house's previous owner was a committed collector. The shed was filled with what Toby and Brian could only call old equipment, and some that were even true collectibles. Some of them even had some resemblance to the thing they had found in the yard. Toby and Brian wandered through the shed, noting antique firearms and shrapnel. They knew they should alert the police, but a stern voice interrupted them. "What are you doing on my property?" Turning quickly, they faced an elderly woman. Gathering his courage, Toby introduced himself as private investigator Tobias Wilson, claiming their visit concerned a police investigation. Her face paled, but she allowed them inside. Inside the dimly lit house, the brothers met John, seated in an armchair. Toby explained their visit, mentioning a suspicious object unearthed at John's former residence. John's expression darkened as he exhaled deeply. "I had hoped my past would remain buried," he admitted, "but it seems secrets have a way of resurfacing." John revealed his passion for collecting antique weaponry, a hobby his wife tolerated. However, 12 years ago, his curiosity led him to a restricted military site. Trespassing, he discovered a massive metallic object he couldn't leave behind. He stored it in his shed, but panic set in when news broke of missing military equipment. Fearing exposure, he buried it during home renovations. hoping to escape consequences. When asked why he moved, John cited proximity to family, but admitted to unease about the buried object. "Every day I feared the newspapers would confirm my worst suspicions," he confessed. Toby pressed for details, and John revealed his belief. The object was a highly destructive bomb. Its presence had haunted him ever since. Recording John's confession, the brothers thanked the elderly couple and returned home. The following morning, they presented the evidence to the police. The tension was palpable as officers reviewed the recording. John's testimony prompted immediate action. The bomb was extracted with military assistance, ensuring the family's safety. Mark, Toby, and Brian's father was released from custody, embracing his family in relief. Back home, the yard was peaceful once more. Months later, the backyard bustled with joy as Patricia's dream of a pool became reality. The family celebrated, grateful their harrowing journey had finally ended. Let us know what you think about this story, and don't forget to share it with your friends. It might inspire them and brighten their day.